In this episode, I want to highlight how science is not impervious to corruption, and how science can be abused by politicians to deliver anti-scientific and irrational outcomes. Politics, it turns out, is science's kryptonite. Science is the interpretation of evidence. Anything else is storytelling. Evidence is retrospective, which means it takes time to accumulate enough evidence to make a decision. Science is the analysis of things that have passed. As time progresses and more evidence is gained, the interpretation of the evidence will hopefully tend towards the most supportable explanation. That is what science is. Science is not about making predictions, it is about making, testable, predictions. Science does not make policy decisions. It does not weigh the impact of outcomes. It just tells you what is supported by the evidence collected so far. And that's the weak spot. If you only provide funding to one side of a complex issue, the other sides will inevitably struggle to match the argument. And that is what happened to science in the coronavirus crisis. The politicians demanded that the science answer questions before all the evidence was available. Science correctly answered that the data was uncertain, but that bad epidemics are possible. And that became the narrative for the rest of 2020. That initial response was not a failing. You can argue that we could have done better. But caution is what drove the initial response. The failing was that no one changed policy when evidence began to mount that coronavirus was not as dangerous as initially expected. That lockdowns, masks and other restrictions on public liberties were actually ineffective and would probably do more harm than the virus. But the political narrative could not be retracted without losing credibility and prestige. As restrictive policies were either now provably wrong or at least very weakly supported. That is where science showed its weakness. That was the failing. Initially in the panic and the fear. Science was used to control populations and instill fear. Not rationality, fear. Later, when the evidence emerges, that undermines the fear narrative. Rather than celebrating that happy outcome. The politicians did not change course. Because they feared losing credibility. And that is why as 2020 rolls to a smoking ruin of a close. Countries with particularly regressive scientifically illiterate governments like the UK are even now enforcing new half-baked rules. Bars are safe to open to 10 p.m., but, not a minute later. Students who occupy shared accommodation cannot go out to restaurants together. All in spite of the evidence from other countries that show that these lockdown-type restrictions have had no effect at all on the outcomes. Science had been used and then discarded. It had failed. Despite what it might look like, politicians are not stupid. But they value political capital more than anything else, that is why they are politicians. Politics is all about storytelling, it has nothing to do with evidence. Political agendas are toxic to science, and that is why science will be blamed for the 2020 debacle, but it was actually politicians who sunk the boat. You are your own best guide through the mess of the modern world. Evaluate the evidence carefully, and understand the processes that are at play. Science is not uninfluenceable, it is not mysterious, it is the obvious sequence of conclusions based on evidence. Only independent rational assessment can deliver you the truth. I cannot tell you what is right, you must figure that out for yourself, using evidence. Take care of yourself. Become the best human being you can be, because ultimately that's all we can ever hope for. Be kind to each other. FTS